And then we started to think about, well, how are we going to tell this story? I mean, you know this from Ship of Dreams. How are we going to tell this story? We have a great story, but now how do we tell it, and how do we tell it visually? And I thought, no sweat, we will compare it to Titanic. It's an all-time maritime disaster, huge loss of life. We'll compare it to Titanic, and everybody will understand. Both in China and elsewhere, people will understand with that frame of reference. And then as I started to sort of go back through my Titanic, bookshelf, which I had, which both of you have, of course, which many of our listeners have, and as I started to read through some of that material and also look at some of the more recent scholarship that had been done, I came across the story of the Chinese sailors that had been on Titanic, and I know I had seen it before. It was not the first time I had ever seen it, but like just about everybody else, I think I clicked on it and read it and said, wow, that's interesting, and there's not that much there.
Titanic Talk with Nelson Aspin and Alexandra Boyd. Here we feature stories from the independent documentary Ship of Dreams Titanic Movie Diaries and everything else to do with the iconic ship. From James Cameron's epic groundbreaking movie to the history and legacy of Titanic herself. Join us and our special guests as we continue the 25th anniversary celebrations of Titanic. This is your first-class ticket to everything aboard the Ship of Dreams.
I'm Nelson Aspin, and it's another episode of Titanic Talk. And in this wonderful web that we are a part of Titanic enthusiasts, our colleague and friend L.A. Reid Beatles introduced us to today's guest, and he's even wearing some of her merch because we don't have any Titanic Talk merch to sell yet, but maybe someday we will. Alexandra Boyd, my co-host from Ship of Dreams Titanic Movie Diaries, will you do the honors of introducing our very special guest?
Well, very special, and I feel a fellow friendship because we're both filmmakers and we both made a film about this ship called Titanic. Stephen Schweickart, thank you so much for coming. Participant writer and in an amazing documentary called The Six, which we're going to talk about in depth with him today.
Yeah, and Stephen is not just a filmmaker, he's a researcher, he's an adventurer. We got to meet in person and we went out to lunch, and he's a real explorer. He's a man of science, and he's an adventurer. And what The Six is about, and I'll leave it to Stephen to explain, but it started out for me when I watched it as like, okay, well, this is as a Titanic enthusiast myself, this is a Titanic story, but it's really so much more. It's a whole mystery about science and life, and so much deeper, if you pardon the pun. Stephen, tell us the elevator pitch of The Six for those who don't know.
Well, thank you both for having me. It's really an honor, and I hope that our listeners will take your gracious introduction with a grain of salt. I'm much less a filmmaker and man of science. I think all that just says is that I'm a dilettante. But for The Six, I mean, excuse me, The Six started out. My partner, the real filmmaker, Arthur Jones, who has been a friend of mine for 20-something years and was, before we ever started out working on a Titanic documentary together. We had made a previous documentary about a sunken British submarine off of China. We were both living in China at the time. I was in Beijing, he was in Shanghai. We had a really good time making the documentary. He made the film. I wrote a book about it. And we thought, wow, that was great. We didn't really make any money,
so people can look for it.
Sure. The documentary is called The Poseidon Project. You can find it on Vimeo, and the book is called Poseidon, and just use my last name to find it. Otherwise, it's the subtitle is so long we wouldn't have time on the podcast for me to say it fully. So we did that, and we didn't really make any money from it, but we didn't really lose any money, and that wasn't the point anyway. So we thought, well, that was fun. What are we going to do next? And I mean, I have loved maritime. I'm a native of New Jersey. I live in New Jersey again now. I'm about 3 miles from the ocean, as we speak. And the ocean and the things that live in it and the things that end up in it have always fascinated me. And then when I was a teenager, I ended up in China, and I was sort of separated from that my own sort of maritime heritage. And then suddenly via Poseidon, they were able to come back together again. So I had quite a number of these projects in mind, great shipwreck tales from China that have never been told, certainly not to a Western audience or an international audience. And I thought, this is great. Let's keep going. So we were actually looking at a Shanghai shipwreck from the late 1940s, sort of the Chinese Civil War period. And we had actually gotten 6 or 7 months down the track on that. We had interviewed some survivors and done some archival work and so forth. And then we started to think about, well, how are we going to tell this story? I mean, this from Ship of Dreams. How are we going to tell this story? We have a great story, but now how do we tell it, and how do we tell it visually? And I thought, no sweat, we will compare it to Titanic. It's an all-time maritime disaster, huge loss of life. We'll compare it to Titanic, and everybody will understand, both in China and elsewhere. People will understand with that frame of reference. And then as I started to sort of go back through my Titanic, bookshelf, which I had, which both of you have, of course, which many of our listeners have. And as I started to read through some of that material and also look at some of the more recent scholarship that had been done, I came across the story of the Chinese sailors that had been on Titanic. And I know I had seen it before. It was not the first time I had ever seen it, but like just about everybody else, I think I clicked on it and read it and said, wow, that's interesting. And there's not that much there, and went on to the next topic.
And certainly we looked into that story also, even though I've leaned into the diaries that the actors wrote and the fans who keep this flame alive of the story of Titanic, because there is a deleted scene, again, as the real aficionados of the film know, there is a deleted scene of one of the sailors, the Chinese sailors, on the piece, the panel of wood, which is where Jim got the idea to actually transfer that story to the Rose and Jack element of the story. But it's all touched upon. And again, there's so many stories that a 90-minute film, which is all I had, and a 3-hour film is all that James Cameron had. You just can't tell them all. So you got to tell this story, but you had a lot of research to do first.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think seeing that deleted scene, I mean, unfortunately, it revealed that I hadn't watched every single bit of my, 2 DVD collector set of Titanic that had also been sitting on the Titanic bookshelf. But this time when I stumbled on that piece of information, it really grabbed me, and I thought, but what happened to these guys? Why don't we know their story? With all due respect, I mean, it seems like every, person from Ireland that was on the ship, we know everything about them, and so many of the passengers, we know their stories, and it's credit to all the researchers who have done all the homework on that. But these were among, the part of the story that really was still not told. And I thought, but why don't we know that? Where are those diaries? Where are those books? Where are those, oral accounts?
But it's shameful too, because they weren't allowed into the country. They were shuffled off and away immediately. I think that's probably why that people, when something like that happens and something is swept under the carpet, there isn't going to be the same level of documentation.
Well, that's certainly correct. I mean, if you go back now and look at material that was always there. I mean, we just put a lot of jigsaw puzzle pieces together more than anything.
But that's exactly right. It was very forensic. It was you performed an autopsy, for lack of a better word, on their story, and you were able, in a beautifully told, dramatic way, which shows your gift as a storyteller. You were able to find what happened to these 6 Chinese gentleman, and there were so many aha moments. I'm cautious about how much I want to spoil here in the podcast for anybody that wants to see it, but there were repeated moments just when you thought, oh, I know where this is going. There was like, you've got to be kidding me, and you find out that the whole notions of class, which seem to come and go with the Titanic story. Some people don't think that there were issues of class, but there certainly were, and the stories of what happened to them. There were so many of those moments. So talk to that too, please, about the investigation that went on, because I mean, yes, you put the puzzle pieces together, but nobody was looking for them before you.
So during Arthur's and my work, we're working on this completely different story that we're just going to happen to compare to Titanic so that it makes sense for the audience. And then at this point, late at night, instead of staring at the ceiling and thinking about the shipwreck I was supposed to be thinking about, of course, I'm thinking about Titanic, and I'm thinking about, the Chinese passengers and what happened to them. So at some point I had to have a come to Titanic moment with Arthur and say to him, I think we're working on the wrong story. And that's imagine if in the middle of, Ship of Dreams, you had said, I think we're going to do something else here. It's especially when you're 6 or 7 months down the track, you think like, why all of a sudden are we not doing this? So
the one thing I did learn that it's the nature of documentary. My first feature film was a narrative that I wrote. I could put anything in it I wanted, but you do have to let the documentary lead you and find its story. I knew that going in, that actually even writing a script, you've got to write a script. It's like, about what? I don't know I want to know what's going to happen, and it unfolds itself just as you're explaining. But 6 or 7 months down the road must have been a little bit daunting at the time.
How did he take it?
He was not so excited. He thought Titanic was a very mainstream story, that there wasn't anything left to explore on it. That certainly doing the kind of story that we do, that there just wasn't going to be anything new to bring out, that it wasn't going to sustain itself over 90 or 100 minutes. But really, when he started to talk to Chinese friends of his and said, I'm thinking about this Titanic thing and whatever, Chinese passengers on Titanic, and all of them sort of reacted the same way, which was, there were Chinese passengers on Titanic. It was really not known, to them or to anyone else, very widely at the time. So I think that really helped. So then we spent about 90 days. I think we set a calendar target of 90 days to say, all right, let's try to disprove this to ourselves. First of all, let's see if there's enough material to work with. And then let's try to disprove to ourselves. Let's see if anybody else has done anything on it. Let's see what stopped them, if anybody had. And then also we're going to have to try to find some family members and so forth. So at the end of the 90 days, we had a few leads, and we realized that we were going to spend a lot of time banging our heads against the wall about the names, which I'll get to in a second. And, we thought, okay, this is worth continuing. Let's keep going. We can always go back to this other story we have, but let's see where this takes us.
And so like any other story about real people, it's real people bring real emotions, and that's this. It's not, your film is not just a clinical film either. As compelling as the mystery is, it's about real people, and you talk to real people, and when we meet Titanic victims, survivors, it becomes even more real and more emotional, and you have all the elements.
I mean, it was tough going in the beginning, because we really scoured, especially from the 100th anniversary, we really scoured accounts and just interviews that people had done, and looks at these different sort of nooks and crannies of the Titanic story, including the Chinese passengers, that where people were trying to find a new angle on it, 100 years, and what do we still not know about it. And I just couldn't believe that nobody hadn't put up their hand and said, my grandfather was a Titanic survivor, or was a Titanic passenger. So if you look at the passenger list, if you are geeky enough to go to the National Archives, the one in New York, the branch in New York, not the one in Washington D.C., but the one in Lower Manhattan, where they actually have a lot of the Titanic records. You can see the list. There's the original passenger list, who got on Titanic, and then there's the list of survivors and who got off. And so we have these 6 names. So there were 8 Chinese passengers, and 6 of them survived. And that's really what piqued our interest was, how could, it's a small sample size, of course, but 75% of the Chinese passengers survived. That's crazy. You have all of the, all 33 Bulgarians die. Why? That kind of thing really drove us. So when we're looking at the names, as Arthur and I both have both studied Mandarin Chinese, but we didn't know any of the other dialects. We haven't studied them. So we're looking at these Romanized names, and we're trying to figure out, well, okay, it's 1912. Where did these guys come from in China? They were all listed as being from Hong Kong, but are these Cantonese names? They're all 2 names at the time. 3 names, was more common. Where do we start? Are these names that came from passports? Are these names that came from, did their employer give these names? So it's just, and then, it wasn't a huge discovery, let's say, but we realized that one of the names, if you look closely at the handwriting on the roster, it doesn't say it. For years, that name had been written as Ali, Ali, like Muhammad Ali, Ali Lam, Lam. But if you really look at it, it says Ahlam. And what that told us was that it's a nickname. Alam is like being called, Little Jimmy. It's just, and we thought, okay, well, great. All right, at least we know that these are names that maybe they gave, but they're not necessarily official names. So that's good news on one hand. It's bad news because now we're not going to find too many papers with that name on it.
Am I right in thinking they were sailors, though? They were military, or is that not true?
Okay, so here's where a lot of the confusion about their story comes in. They were professional sailors. They were mariners, but they were not part of Titanic's crew. Okay, a lot of times because that was their profession, everyone says, "Oh, well, they were Titanic's crew," and that's why they were on the ship. No, that was not it. They're professional mariners, but they were being seconded from their employer, the Donald line, not the Donaldson line, which was a passenger liner. That's commonly miswritten that way, but they were being seconded from the UK operations of the Donald line, which was essentially a cargo company, a fruit boat company. They were being seconded from the UK over to the US lines. Now, Chinese sailors, even though they were not able to enter the United States legally at that point because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, they could work on ships that were traveling up and down the North American coast.
And these guys couldn't get off the Carpathia, could they? I mean, is that right? Is that when they survived only to have to turn around and get out?
That's correct. Yeah. I mean, they were there to meet their ship. The reason they were on Titanic was because they were meeting a ship on which they were then going to work in the engine room or in the kitchen, the Annetta. And but because it was known that they were on board, unlike all the other passengers who received some kind of aid or family came and met them, or just there was someone in some capacity there to meet them, even if it was the Salvation Army. The people that met the 6 Chinese passengers were essentially the equivalent of today's immigration service, and they kept them on Carpathia overnight. They were not allowed to get off the ship, which is both good and bad. Carpathia was probably more comfortable than any place they would have ended up, but they probably didn't get to do all the things they thought they would get to do in New York, get a fresh set of clothes, get a decent Chinese meal, maybe send a letter or two. They had no way to, notify anyone about the death of the other 2 Chinese passengers if they happened to be related or they happened to be friends. So, the next morning they spend another night on Carpathia, and then they're whisked over to, for anyone who lives in Manhattan or knows New York, if the helicopter landing pad which I believe is Pier 11. That's just about where they were going to. They would have gotten on. They got on Pier 9. Pier 9 doesn't exist anymore. But yeah, so it's, it wasn't a warm welcome. It was not. Nobody lifted the lamp again to the golden door for them at that point. And then, probably, I don't know. I'm sure they were dealing with a fair bit of shock and sadness over the loss of their fellow passengers, but at the same time, they had just lost everything. So
yeah, well,
they
let
were
alone the
probably relieved
experience.
to have a job to go to. They
Well, and
get
the
off and, all
experience
right,
of
well,
being in the water. And
yeah.
one of the things I found most compelling in your documentary is the way you to sort of debunk the rumor that they had used some nefarious methods to survive, that they had maybe disguised themselves as women or at the cost of somebody else's life, because there was so much prejudice anyway against the Chinese. Did they steal into the lifeboat somehow? Did they take the place of somebody else that should have gotten those places? And you recreated the lifeboat, which was brilliant. And so, I mean, it was not just compelling mystery solving, but it was visually compelling to watch you to do that and test it out. Speak a little bit about that, if you can.
When we got into this, I mean, Arthur is a fantastic documentarian of process and emotion. He doesn't really care whether we find anything, but he really hopes that we're really angry or really really happy about it at the end, and show it along the way. Nothing better than a thrown mobile phone to express how somebody feels at a particular moment. And let's face it, how do you show people looking at archival photos and make it interesting? It's just not, it's just not going to be that exciting. But, when I started to look at what we were intended to do, I thought, one of the reasons that the, that the ongoing slander, frankly, of the Chinese passengers has continued for over a century is because people just kept repeating the same story. And I thought, if we're going to do this, we need to do this in a way that the evidence speaks, not the Brooklyn Eagle, from 1912. We need to know, was this physically, physics will tell the story, science will tell the story, not some, record from 100 years ago. And building the lifeboat was the only way to do that. And I remember the day that I told Arthur about it, and I said, well, we're going to build a lifeboat. And he said, what do you know about building boats? And I said, absolutely nothing. And I don't need to know anything about it, because I'm going to find a group of people who do, and they're going to work with us. And I really had no idea at that moment. I thought, well, maybe an international school, but I really didn't, I didn't have a Rolodex full of boat builders. But the same thing is true with the cold water. All of these things can be tested. All of these things, especially now, can be modeled.
And you got cold in the film. You put your body to the test.
I did indeed. And but really that was the only way. We had no agenda when we started to make the documentary. We had no agenda to say, oh, the Chinese have been maligned or what. That wasn't our intent at all. That's where the chips fell, but that really is not what we set out to do. What we wanted to do was find out what actually happened, and the only way to do that was by building a life-size model, because we figured if we build a small model, I mean, you both know what the Titanic community is like, okay? It is a private club, but there are certain people you don't want to sit next to at dinner, So, I had those voices in the back of my head the whole time, what they were going to say, how they were going to try to debunk it. And I thought the only way to do this is to do it life size, because if we do it 1/10 and we try to stick Kens and Barbies underneath the seats, they're going to say, that's not an accurate representation. So we had to do it with real people. Is that where
James Cameron came in? Because Jim would have had a lot of research and background to fold into that part of it, or was he involved in other parts of the film?
So if there's ever a DVD release, there may be a short section called, what did James Cameron know and when did he know it?
The extras.
Because that was one of our early questions. Once we saw the deleted scene, saw that a Chinese passenger was being rescued, knowing that that was a story that was based on fact, we thought, okay, well, Cameron knew about this. So if Cameron knew, how much of the Chinese story does he know? And is there a file sitting around with labeled Chinese passengers? And did it inspire the Jack and Rose ending? Gee, it seems similar. Rescue from the water, floating on a board. Okay. So I had met Cameron in Beijing in 2011 at a press conference, and I met some of the folks around him, and I stored all those contacts for a rainy day. And that rainy day came around in like 2018, and so I sort of knew. I didn't know him personally, certainly, but I sort of knew people around him from the Explorers Club. And Arthur, by the same token, knew some people from the film industry, and so we just tried to sort of meet in the middle with our contacts. And when we were finally able to get his attention, because he was neck deep in Avatar, when we were finally able to get his attention, he was really excited about it. And because he, say what you like about the film or the man or whatever, he is a bona fide Titanic expert. And he never gets enough credit for it. And I think he never gets to spend enough time on it, especially now. But
I do call him the original Titaniac. He's the
absolutely
he's the fulcrum. He's the thing that set this all off in the last 25 years. And even the people who love to discredit the film because it's not true to history miss the point that he reignited and ignited a whole new generation of people to take interest, young people to take interest in this story and have empathy for it.
Absolutely. And once we saw, if you watch Titanic carefully, you see a Chinese passenger. There's not 8 Chinese passengers,
right.
But you see a single Chinese passenger pop up in the background. To Cameron's credit, the Titanic passengers, especially the third class passengers, were a very diverse group. And if you look at the background, if you can take your eyes off of Leo for a moment, you'll see that the other folks in third class are, they have very different costumes. They have very different appearances. He did a good job of making sure that there was a representation of, a wider group than just, a bunch of Irishmen. I say my grandmother's maiden name was Donahue, so I'm not casting aspersions on my own people, but so we felt that we had a real reason to ask him about this. We wanted to get him talking about it on film. What did he know about it? Could he point us in a particular direction? Did it inspire the Jack and Rose ending? We never thought like, oh, come on, let's see if we can get, Cameron involved and whatever. And then once, we got his attention. So it came down to, we were basically wrapped. We were done, and it was July 2019. Film was due out in April. We had to go to post, and we just kind of went back to him and said, look, we appreciate that you're super busy, but we got to do this. If you want to participate, that's great. And our offer to him had always been, we'll take any 15 minutes you have anywhere in the world. Okay. So pro tip, when you ask someone, of James Cameron's caliber, when you make him that kind of offer, make it 30 minutes. Okay. Because you are going to go anywhere in the world, but at least ask.
Where did you end up filming him?
So we were supposed to go to LA that July 4th weekend, 2019, and there was an earthquake there. And so he's like, okay, not going to LA, forget it. So he said, well, if you want this interview, you got to come to Wellington, New Zealand. We said, okay. So we flew down to Wellington. I think I was there 60 hours. I think Arthur was there 36. Charming little town. I think we had 2 or 3 full meals while we were there. But yeah, we went down, and he was great, and he was exceptionally gracious. You can see the answers in the film. I won't give them away, but he really, afterwards he said, hey, what else can I do for you? I think this is a great project. What else can I do for you? and you know, he was the one who proposed that he executive produce the film, and that made such a huge difference to us because it allowed us to use footage from his film that otherwise we never would have gotten. Not to mention, you know, his expert presence. So, you know,
Well, and you
we're
also,
super grateful.
like in Ship of Dreams, Titanic Movie Diaries, your art director did a marvelous job of using illustrations as well. I mean, as in Ship of Dreams as well, with the illustrations that Alexandra employed. But to just have so many of those elements, from the music, illustrations. Yes, clips are valuable too, certainly in this case. But at the end of the day, it is the story. So we have a couple of the things I want to talk to you about before we get to the end of our episode here. So I do want to just remind listeners that The Six, spelled out SIX, thesixdocumentary.com is where you can find out more information about seeing this film. And it's done well in festivals. It's completely compelling. It's quite an achievement. And you also have, because you mentioned at the top of this podcast about your being in New Jersey, you have a New Jersey themed Titanic podcast.
I do. So the podcast was Arthur's idea because so I moved back to New Jersey from China after being in China for 25 years. I moved back a couple of years ago, and you know, I wanted to keep doing the kind of work that I was doing, you know, historical research and maritime history and those kinds of things. And New Jersey certainly has a rich maritime history. It doesn't have a specific Titanic history, or so I thought. But I thought, well, what can I do that would sort of keep me engaged in the same way? So, you know, again, I just started up with Encyclopedia Titanica and Google and, you know, just sort of the easy open source references. And I started to realize that there were a lot of Titanic passengers and crew who had a significant tie to New Jersey. Either they were from here, they were coming here, or you know, they died here, perhaps they're buried here. And I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. That'll keep me busy. And originally, I just wanted to do it as a book. I just wanted to kind of do it as a book that you'd buy in a Jersey Shore gift shop, you know. But Arthur suggested that I do it as a podcast, and you know, credit to both of you, because podcasting has been so much of a challenge for me. It's not the storytelling, it's just the technical elements that really bog me down. I'm not particularly technically inclined, and so, you know, luckily I'm using an outside editor, Alexia, from Crow's Nest Studios, down in Austin, Texas. She has a podcast called Titanic Talk Line.
We're all related.
She's been a big help, and you know, it's just a question of putting the stories together. But what I love about it is that, first of all, I think I'm up to 60 names now who have one kind of connection or another. And what I like about it is that it allows me to look at very different aspects of the Titanic story. The most recent episode, you know, it's just a chance to look at the third class passengers and their opportunities for escape. You know, why did so many women and children die on a ship where women and children first, at least, and if not women and children only, was supposedly the rule. So what I like about
I've
it
always
is
asked if my first class passenger character survived. Did I get in a lifeboat? And I didn't get in a lifeboat, but I have to assume, I have to assume that she did, because one of the numbers I heard was that more first class women survived than third class children. And that right there says it.
Well, Stephen, you told me over our lunch, if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think I was drinking at that lunch, but I seem to recall that didn't you tell me that more second-class men died? There was a disproportionate amount, and that sort of had to go with the whole the men stay behind mentality. Like the third-class men, they got in the water, so they, you know, had more of a chance than the second-class men who sort of felt like they had to, through chivalry, stay behind.
So yes, that's correct. I think only 14 out of 100 and something. I have it written on a post-it somewhere, but you know, only 14 out of 100 and something second-class male passengers survived. They had a very, very low survival rate, and I think probably part of that was access. They didn't quite get the same access as first class passengers would have. But I
Might
think
have been
also they
something as simple
probably
as where their doors were situated, where the stairways and the doors, those doors were locked. I mean, we see that in the film, and of course, that's been a controversial talking point as well. But it could have been something simple as logistics.
It certainly could have. I think the second class passengers or the second class male passengers might have felt very much like their first class counterparts that, hey, I'm a gentleman and I dare not, enter a boat, and therefore, they would have had to. I mean, I think Jack Thayer is a second class passenger, so we can learn more about that from his account. The only Japanese passenger.
Jack was first. I think you're thinking of Lawrence Beasley. Lawrence Beasley was
yes, you are correct. Yes, that's right. So Beasley, the Beasley account is good for sort of seeing what the situation of the second class men was. The only Japanese passenger that was on board, he survived. He was a second class passenger. He took 2 shots at it and finally got it. He was pushed away from one boat and finally got into another, and then was pilloried for the rest of his life for surviving. How dare he take someone's seat? But yeah, I mean, it just
Which
being
he
able
wouldn't
to
have
look at
done
those
because
stories.
the lifeboats weren't full. People weren't getting into the lifeboats. They didn't want to.
I'm going to be
the
party pooper. I have to. I'm looking at the clock, and we're going to have to wind this up. Sadly, the marvelous thing is that we're in each other's clutches. I don't know what the connection could be to New Jersey. Maybe a Bruce Springsteen is a Titanic fan, but we've got to do something.
He is. Yeah.
Who wouldn't be?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
I could, he's as soon as he gets over his peptic ulcer or whatever it is, he's gonna maybe he can do a version of "My Heart Will Go On."
Can you imagine?
Schwankert.
Okay,
No,
I want to hear
cannot.
that now.
I can't. I cannot imagine that. But Bruce could do it. I know he's got it in him to do it, but I can't imagine it at the moment.
He's a Jersey boy who likes the Titanic, and so are you. So we're grateful to you, Stephen Schwankert. We love The Six, and now you're stuck with us. We're friends for life.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Stephen.
It's an honor and not a curse. So thank you both for having me.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review. And if you'd like to hear more podcasts like this, hit the subscribe button. For information on where you can see Ship of Dreams, Titanic Movie Diaries, go to shipofdreamsfilm.com. Titanic Talk is a production of Ship of Dreams Film Limited. To celebrate Season 2 of Titanic Talk, we've launched a line of Titanic Talk merch. A cap, a mug, a tote, a t-shirt or a hoodie. You'll be sure to find a unique gift for the Titaniac in your life. Look for the link in the notes and on Instagram, or go to bit.ly/Titanic Talk Shop.